Hey guys, so today I have Dogen with me. So Dogen, thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so we just recorded a video where Dogen was kind of interviewing me. That's going to go up on his channel. So definitely go and check that out as well. And so yeah, in this video, I have some questions that I came up with to get Dogen's insight on things relating to mainly three topics, three categories of things that I wanted to talk to with Dogen about today, which is first of all just like American sense of humor versus Japanese sense of humor, and then just reaching a really high level of Japanese ability in general. And then if we have time, maybe getting into some nitty gritty pitch accent stuff as well.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome, awesome. So let's jump right in. So for me personally, I've had a interesting relationship with Japanese comedy. At first, I thought it was funny just because I was so enamored with Japanese culture in general that I just would convince myself that if it was Japanese, it was good, and I wasn't very critical. Then I went through a kind of cynical phase where I was like, "What's funny about this? I don't get it at all," and stuff. And then I kind of came around and I started to kind of get it more on a more intuitive
Right.
level. And I was like, "Okay, yeah, this some of this is pretty funny." But at the end of the day, nothing really can do it for me like a good American stand-up comedian can do it for me when it comes to comedy. So, like, what's your take on Japanese comedy? What do you feel about it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There's kind of like a micro answer to this question and a macro answer. Sorry, I'm going to be looking at the computer a lot as I'm speaking with speaking with Matt, sorry, over Skype right now. So apologies if I look at my computer too much, but I do think that there's this general, I don't know, tribalism among humans, and we tend to think that whatever we're brought up with is the best. And I don't know, for whatever reason, sometimes people like us, we experience the opposite of that early on when we get enamored by something else, be it Japan or be it, I don't know, K-pop or whatever it might be. But then there are further steps that we take in our life, and as we go up that, I don't know, ladder, we see things from a different angle and maybe come back and think that the group that we belonged to at the beginning was the best, did have the best humor or whatever. And I kind of went through a similar phase with like Japanese music, where I started listening to Japanese music in my teens, and anything that was Japanese I thought was amazing, no matter what. And I did find a lot of really good Japanese music from that phase, but after a while, I started listening to American music again, and I was like, hold on a second, this is really good too. But when it comes to comedy, I do think that my general sensitivities are much more inclined to American stand-up. I much prefer. Well, there's many different kinds of humor. Obviously, there's self-deprecating humor. There's slapstick humor. There's I don't know. There's tricks in humor like the callback and stuff like that. But I do find personally that the more kind of crafted a joke is, the more I enjoy it. And I think that there's kind of a misconception. I don't know. There's some truth to it for sure that Japanese humor is all slapstick. And again, there is a lot of Japanese humor that is slapstick, but there are a lot of really, really kind of more. There are a lot of subtleties in Japanese humor as well that I think a lot of people don't necessarily pick up on. And once your Japanese reaches a certain level, as you mentioned earlier, it's like you kind of come back around and it's like, oh, okay, there are unique, or not unique, but very high level things about this humor that I didn't necessarily understand initially. But personally, the humor that I like most is American and British stand-up. Some of my favorite comedians are Ricky Gervais, Dave Chappelle, Bill Burr. I really like Song, the Japanese
Oh yeah.
comedian.
Oh really?
I think he's amazing as well. He's not a stand-up really. He's more of a shikaisha. I don't know.
Announcer. He like leads shows. He's like the host in a lot of shows.
Yeah, he hosts a lot of shows. But the thing with creating comedy, like what I do on my channel, is that typically the smaller the strike zone, the stronger the joke.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I saw in the questions that you had sent me in advance is like, what audience do you try and create the joke for? And I've always tried to create the joke that I find the funniest. And I don't think about the audience. Hayao Miyazaki actually has a really good quote about this. Someone asked him what audience was Spirited Away made for? And he said 12-year-old girls. It was made for 12-year-old girls. And that's because in making something so specific, people from all ranges of life and all different ages, they can see those specific things. But when you try and kind of play to everyone, your content, whether it's comedy or whatever it might be, it tends to get more and more vague. And with comedy in particular, the vaguer something is, the weaker it becomes. So I always, again, as I mentioned a second ago, I try and make the thing that would be the funniest for me, even though I know that sometimes that results in jokes that often go over my audience's head, whether it might be the Gaijin audience or the Japanese audience.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because I remember I had been hearing about you from just other people in the Japanese community before I actually watched your videos. And I kind of just assumed that you probably weren't that good at Japanese and weren't that legit, just because to be honest, most people in the community aren't that good when you just hear about them. So when I watched your videos, I was doubly shocked because first of all, you're actually super amazing at Japanese. But second of all, I found you really funny. And there were a lot of jokes that I felt like I can only understand this because I'm an American who speaks English natively and I'm at a very high Japanese level. And I was surprised because I was like, is this really popular? Because I doubt most of the people in his audience are getting some of these jokes that I'm getting. Yeah. And I was like, it almost felt like, it was speaking right at me, a lot of the stuff. I remember I just went through your whole, the Japanese comedy playlist and cracking up on a bunch of them.
Yeah. The more specific the joke is, the better. And I mean, that's something that I kind of learned from writing in general. I don't know if you could just like a very arbitrary example, but like if you start a book, I don't know how deep I should go down this particular topic, but essentially I had this experience in college, and I've talked about this a little bit before. I'll be brief, where we had an assignment where we had to write the opening line of a book from 9 different perspectives, essentially. And I did the assignment, and I submitted it, and my teacher said, okay, you're not very good at anything but comedy. And I was like, what? Because comedy was the last thing that I thought that I'd be good at. And it really had to do with like the small details. And I in retrospect, I realized that the reason that I wasn't good at the other things is because I was trying too hard to emulate great writers, and when I'm not a great writer. So I was trying to write like, I don't know, like Hemingway or like Mishima Yukio and stuff like these, like incredible genius authors that there's no way I could ever emulate because I'm not even a very well-read person. And so when I would relax a little bit and just let myself write a little bit more naturally, I didn't ever realize it, but comedy is the thing that worked best for me. And there was multiple times in my life after that point where I experienced something very, very similar. Like I had spent like a year writing this like very short story in Japanese, and I showed it to a friend, and they were like, "This is not good, but this thing that you wrote about like pooping your pants in Starbucks, this is pretty funny." So I kept getting the same advice and the same feedback. It's like, you shouldn't try and be a great writer, but you're okay at comedy, so you might want to try and pursue that. So that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And I guess to kind of just tie it into moving more into the Japanese ability stuff. So like one of the things I was wondering, and I think this is an issue that you start to really it starts to kind of come into view once you start reaching a higher level, is finding your voice in Japanese, because you realize that like in English, like I know for me, there was never really a time where I decided what kind of personality I was going to have and what way I was going to speak like, because this just formed organically before when I was a little child, just gradually over time as I got older. So I never had to sit down and be like, how do I want, what kind of speaking style do I want? Like, what kind of person do I
Right.
want to be?
Yeah.
But in Japanese, you learn it as an adult. You kind of are stuck with this decision, and you have to kind of reinvent yourself in the language. And this is something I still struggle with, and sometimes I feel awkward about, like I'm copying something but I'm not fully embodying it. So how did you find your voice in Japanese comedy, especially given that you're not really doing traditional style of Japanese comedy, like, you know, manzai or anything like that? So
That's another really interesting question. One of the things that I'd like to emphasize for this particular point is that the idea, if we're just talking about comedy and not necessarily speaking Japanese in general, the idea is always paramount. And so I had a realization fairly early on through those experiences that I talked about earlier when people were giving me constructive criticism, where the only thing that matters is the idea. And the simpler that you can express a certain idea, the better it is. Simple, but also specific. And so initially, I was trying to express complicated ideas with complicated prose because I thought complicated prose was sophisticated. And it can be, obviously, but in trying to write sophisticated prose in Japanese, I ended up making much more mistakes.
I see.
You know, trying to use like a bunch of like N1 grammar and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
You know, it just ended up making things much more unnatural. And once I tried to just focus everything on the idea, I realized that you can express complicated, subtle ideas, funny things with relatively simple grammar. And that's kind of been my guiding point ever since then. Whenever I have an idea or something for a video or a joke that I want to make, I always try and express it in the simplest, but also the correct words. But I often write like a sentence like one time, and that's the idea. And I do this on Twitter as well. Maybe I should talk about this because I don't really talk about my Twitter on my YouTube that much, but I often make like jokes on Twitter in English, but they're about Japan, about Japanese and stuff like that. And whenever I tweet something that's a joke, oftentimes what ends up getting posted is something that I've written down, looked at for like 20 minutes, rewritten like 5 times, and removed like as many words as I absolutely can. And then what finally gets up there, it's usually like this very simple, short, concise sentence. But it's because all of the things, all the distractions, all of the words that don't actually need to be there are gone. It becomes that much easier for people to immediately get it once they see it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So that same process in both English and Japanese. Simple, express fair. I don't know. The idea doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to be funny. But you can't express anything in an overly complicated way and still be funny.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It almost kind of sounds like you're saying that being a good writer or a good speaker perhaps is something that's not language specific. It's almost like meta to specific languages, and there's these kind of principles that you can embody.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, actually. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but one of the things that I never speak about on my channel, but maybe it would be interesting to talk about it here. I don't like to reveal kind of like my process, so to speak, on my channel because, you know, it's like the joke about dissecting the frog. How does the joke work? Well, you can explain how the joke works, but in dissecting the joke, you kill the frog. You know, or in dissecting the frog, you kill the frog. In explaining the joke, you destroy the joke. So I don't talk about my process, so to speak, on my channel too much. But I do think that their writing and comedy is kind of completely independent of my Japanese. And I think that this is one of the reasons we talked about this in the other video a little bit, but that my Japanese isn't better than it currently is because my attention gets divided between writing and comedy and in Japanese.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really interesting, and I can relate to that as well, because there's been times where I worked really hard on the technical aspects of my Japanese, but then it's kind of been like, well, what do I say with this Japanese that I worked so hard on? And there kind of came a point where I realized that, I mean, being really good at Japanese in a technical sense is really great, but if you don't have something interesting to say, it's completely pointless. And
Right.
it's like language is a tool, so you can have the sharpest knife in the world. If you have nothing to cut, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a fair amount of people that think my Japanese is better than it actually is simply because I'm making them laugh. So I kind of get them on my side, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And that's something that I always feel too, is I know sometimes a lot of people in my community, I mean, it's my fault that I attract these type of people, but there's people who put a lot of emphasis and a lot of value on just very technical perfection when it comes to language ability. But when I see someone whose language ability might not be that great, but they're doing something cool with the language, like making someone laugh or educating people, teaching people, inspiring people, I think that's way cooler. And that's ultimately has more value than just being really awesome at Japanese but not doing anything with it.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think I fall into this trap. It's something I want to do more in the future. I want to actually use my Japanese to have a positive impact on the world.
Yeah, in terms of, なんて言うんだっけ? 優先順位?
Priorities?
Yeah, priorities. For me, the idea is more important than the Japanese. So, obviously, because I teach Japanese on Patreon as well, I put a lot of time and research into each of those lessons, and I always reference a bunch of books, and I try and interview native speakers when necessary as well. But when it comes to the comedy, when I'm making the video, oftentimes what I'll do is, if there's a particular bit where I have a take that I've shot maybe 3 or 4 times, I'll choose the take that I perceive to be funniest, even if that particular take doesn't have the best Japanese for the comedic videos.
That's really interesting. But that makes total sense. Yeah. Yeah, because it makes sense. It's like making people laugh is the priority, not being perfect. Because what's the point of that? So yeah, awesome. Well, I guess now moving more into kind of the technical learning Japanese stuff. So one kind of just, funny, potentially not funny thing is, there's this trend in Japanese of more and more English loanwords being used and replacing traditional Japanese words and things like that. And it is getting really bad. Like, I've recently actually heard Japanese people in a debate say, まあ僕も agree なんですけど, and or saying, or like lately I heard mind being used a lot to mean like kangai kata and things like that. And of course, as an English speaker, this makes me cringe, and you've poked a lot of fun at this in your videos, but like on a serious note, do you think that this trend is going to keep going and it's actually going to end up where Japanese is like it is in your video called Japanese in 10 years, where like 3/4 of all the words are just English loan words? Or do you actually have some hope that eventually this trend will run itself out and Japanese words will go back in style?
Right. This is such an interesting topic, and there are many reasons for this. And the first being, okay, I do believe that this is going to get worse before it gets better. If it even ever does get better. It might not.
Oh no.
That aside, and this is kind of what I think about when I'm making my videos. It's like, as a I don't know. It's God, I hate to say as a comedian, as a comedian. But the thing is, when you do what I'm doing, trying to make people laugh, you have to be opinionated about essentially everything. Because if you don't have a strong opinion, then you can't form an argument and leverage reality to make jokes, so to speak. So I'm very opinionated about essentially everything, whether it's politics or whether it's, what we're talking about right now, like katakana loanwords in Japanese. But the thing is, you can't get to a point where you're preaching. Because if you preach, people instinctively pull back, and there's like a people push you back instinctively. So whenever I try and talk about something that I feel strongly about, I do so through comedy. I don't think it's right to try and tell people how to think, whether it is about politics or whether it is about, loan words in Japanese or whatever it might be. So I personally don't like the trend of loan words becoming more and more prevalent, in Japanese. But the thing is, at the same time, it's like, what right do I have to say, no, 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 Japan, stop right there, Because it's like, I'm a foreigner in Japan, so I'm contributing, to Japan becoming more global at the exact same time as that I'm saying this is bad,
Yeah.
So the only way I can really make a statement about this particular phenomenon and express my opinion at the same time without invoking the anger and like the not repulsion, but that, defense of a bunch of people is to do so through comedy. So whenever I try and express an opinion, again, it's through comedy, knowing that everyone has their own opinion.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there's a lot of actual practical reasons why you could argue why this trend is a negative thing for Japanese as a language, besides just that it's kind of cringy if you're an English speaker.
Yeah.
Because original Japanese words, I mean, the other thing is that I like to point out is that half of Japanese is actually Chinese, technically speaking. If you're
right. Exactly.
All the kanji words. So in a way, this whole process already played out once, and now Japanese is half not Japanese. But the thing is with kanji is you can look at a kanji word you've never seen before, and you can get the meaning roughly and the reading.
Yeah.
But if you're a Japanese person who doesn't know English and you're not that familiar with English morphemes, when you hear a new loan word, it means nothing to you, and also it just doesn't fit that well with the Japanese phonetic system. So you have all these words that sound super similar, and even Japanese people struggle with it. And so in a way, information's getting lost, and Japanese is becoming less efficient to read and understand at a technical level.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but that's absolutely correct, I think.
Yeah, so it's concerning to me as someone who's committed to having Japanese be a part of their life for the rest of my life, essentially. But hopefully they go all the way around and they take their pride back, and they're like, no, English isn't cool. Japanese is the coolest.
Yeah. Well, again, one of the things that I try and do is I try and pull jokes out of wherever I can. So like the very fact that you and I have spent, I don't know how long you've been studying Japanese in total, but for me, it's been more than 10 years.
Yeah, I'm at pretty much 10 years.
Yeah. So it's a tragedy that we spent so much time studying this thing that is changing completely. But tragedy makes for really, really good comedy. So I've made several jokes before. Like I made one in the recent Q&A video. It's like, why would you want to study Japanese right now if it's just going to be English? So it's like, well, because you can have the opportunity to brag about how you studied Japanese for 4 whole years before it was English. Or I talked about in the past. I forget exactly what the premise of the video was, but I made a joke, something along the lines of something similar. It was, I've studied Japanese for, again, 10 plus years, and look at this, great, now it's English. So right as soon as I got to the level of fluency, it changed into English.
That's pretty funny.
Again, that makes for a good joke,
totally.
But not for, I don't know. For us, it is tragic. Yeah,
like I know I should probably move on, but the other point that I had that like I actually just realized this the other day. I'm like, if Japanese does become like 3/4 all loan words, and then kanji are not going to be used very often. Yet Japanese people and people learning Japanese are still going to have to learn kanji because you're going to have to learn those few words. So now you're learning these 2,000 characters just so you can read like a relatively small portion of the words in the language, and that's just going to be a real disaster. But
yeah.
If that actually happens.
Yeah, there's a logistics, statistical analysis that needs to be done there.
Yeah. But anyway, so another thing that, I've experienced is that sometimes when I spend a lot of time in Japanese, it actually makes it harder for me to speak English. And when I'm trying to speak English, Japanese words will pop into my mind. I can't think of the right one. And yet my Japanese still isn't perfect. So sometimes I'm worried that I'm going to end up in this chuto hampa situation where I don't speak any language perfectly natively. And I'm wondering if you've ever experienced this, especially living in Japan.
Yes, absolutely. And there's so many things I'd like to say about this. again, we talked about earlier how becoming very fluent in a language by itself, that's great, but you want to be able to leverage it in some way, right? That's what I try and do through my comedic videos. But I agree 100% that the better my Japanese became, the worse my English got, and vice versa. Like after the 2016 election in the States, that was when I started, or I guess leading up to the election. And since then, I started paying much more attention to politics and philosophy and stuff like that. And in doing so, I was exposed to a lot of the words that I think the typical American would acquire during the later years of university and after university, and just becoming, an adult in American society. But just a lot of terms and expressions and stuff like that political things mostly and philosophical things, but that I became exposed to later in life. And after becoming more interested in those things and, devoting more time to reading American novels and stuff like that, and English novels as well, British novels, UK, I could feel my Japanese starting to suffer. But I think that one of the reasons, and I hate to sound like I'm bragging or whatever, but one of the reasons that I think that I am able to kind of do comedy at all is because my personality has the tendency to sort of second guess things.
Okay.
And so it makes me very ineloquent. I don't sound eloquent when I speak. So whether it's in English or in Japanese, but that same tendency to second guess what I'm going to say is also what I think makes me an okay editor, which is what ends up making, the jokes that I make somewhat decent, hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, that's really, I've definitely experienced the same thing where I think at a certain level, what causes this is that the way that Japanese people think, not in the sense of what are their values, but in the sense of how the fundamental building blocks of the way they express thoughts is so fundamentally different than English, that in order to have a mind that thinks in a completely Japanese way, that means by definition that you have a mind that doesn't think in the way that someone born and raised in America would think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So
it's almost like to be fully one, by definition, you can't be the other. And you end up saying unnatural things. I know sometimes I have a Japanese style thought that I translate into English and just say it, and they know what I mean, but I am aware of the fact that if I didn't know Japanese, I probably never would have had that style of thought, and the reverse happens as well. So it's a tricky thing. And also, Japanese people in general are monolingual. They only speak Japanese. And American people in general are monolingual. And so by being bilingual, you're kind of committing to being at this disadvantage in each language because you're spending half as much time as anyone else in any one language. So that's another thing I never thought about before I got fluent in Japanese.
Yeah. That's one of the things I picked up in university, and a lot of people have told me that this isn't actually the case, but this is something that I learned in one of my linguistics classes is that people that are typically brought up in a bilingual environment typically have their lexicon, so the total number of words that they know, it's the same in terms of amount as someone who's brought up in a monolingual environment, but typically that's just split between the two languages. So if an American child knows arbitrary number 3,000 words that are all English, and a Japanese child knows 3,000 words that are all Japanese, someone who's brought up in a bilingual environment will typically have, if the balance is even, 1,500 and 1,500 in each language, provided they're not doing additional effort on the side, like going to a language school or something like that. So, and I've briefly touched about this on my channel a couple times, but my friend Joey, the anime man, one of the reasons that he's always been kind of an inspiration for me is because he's one of the few people that I know that is not only completely bilingual, he's extremely eloquent in both languages. So that's a result of effort, intelligence, and practice over time as well. So there's a misconception, I think, that people who are completely bilingual never worked for it.
Totally. And yeah, that's totally been my experience as well. I went to at my college, there was a lot of people who were Japanese ethnically, and their parents were immigrants, and so they spoke Japanese in the household, but they still had a kind of an accent, and their vocabulary was very small, and they struggled with kanji and things like that. And yeah, it's hard to find someone who is like Joey. It is that pretty much 100% in like the equivalent of two monolinguals in one.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something I aspire to, but feel like I still have a ways to go.
Yeah, me too. Definitely.
But on that note, so kind of talking about the differences, we went into this on the video for your channel, the differences between first language acquisition and second language acquisition, and how there are definite differences. But I think I'm curious to hear subjectively, how does, now that you've gotten to the level you've had that you're at Japanese, like a lot of people would say you've mastered Japanese. I don't know if you would say that. I wouldn't say that I've mastered Japanese, because once you actually get there, there's so much better, so many ways you could improve. But being at pretty much the top percentile, like maybe 99th percentile when it comes to Japanese ability among foreigners, what is your subjective experience? Because I know for me personally, it feels quite different to speak in Japanese, and it's kind of separate from level. It's almost like the process that my brain goes through is just a different type of process compared to when I speak English.
Yeah, I agree, and I definitely don't think that I've mastered Japanese. We talked about this as you just mentioned on the other video that we did. But even if people like us are in that, maybe we're in the 99%, maybe it's a little bit lower. I don't know. Could be either one. The thing is, even if we're 99 out of 100, that doesn't mean that our Japanese is 99% perfect.
Totally.
Right. We might be better than 99 people out of 100, but that we might be at a 90% level in terms of pronunciation versus a completely native speaker. So that's one thing that I'd like to briefly mention. And that's kind of how I feel about my own Japanese. I think it's better than most foreigners, but I know that it's still not completely native for sure. But I do think certainly there's kind of like a mental fog that I have when speaking in Japanese.
I know exactly what you mean.
So like when I'm speaking in English, I can kind of just relax and fall back onto my vocabulary as I'm speaking, and the words will kind of come up naturally. But in Japanese, there's a little bit more effort involved in finding those words as I'm speaking, and I can say with certainty that since putting a good amount of my available effort into creating comedy, that fog has thickened, because as I talked about earlier, I end up second guessing a lot of things, and that makes me worse as a Japanese speaker, but better as a writer and as someone who tells jokes. So yeah, there's certainly there's a fog there, and even though it's not just the fog either, I feel that there's some amounts of this in Japanese or in English when I speak English as well. This might be just because I'm kind of neurotic in general, but in Japanese, the level, my conversational level is largely dependent on the person that I'm speaking with.
Not the subject, but the actual person?
The person. The subject as well is very, very important. But if it's someone that I've known for like a long time and I've spoken with them in Japanese the entire time that I've known them, not a big deal. But if it's someone that I don't know, and like maybe they're bilingual, like there's someone like Joey, then like there's like a weird kind of pressure for me to like sound better than I actually am, and I try and kind of like overcompensate for my personality, which is again quite neurotic. So I'll try and kind of push faster in speaking than I normally would in English. So there's more neuroticism when I'm speaking in Japanese with people than exists in English. And even if I'm not speaking with people, even if I'm just doing like an impromptu like YouTube video, it's like, yeah, I overthink things a lot.
I totally relate to what you're saying. And actually, until you said that, I never realized that this is definitely true for me as well. Where, because you'd think it would be having to do with the topic when it comes to your comfort level and speaking. But no, you're right. Because in a way, it's like, because my Japanese is not the same level as my English. Like, I like when you said it, it's like there's this fog. I totally know what you mean. For me, one metaphor that I came up with was, it's like doing things in English is like using my bare hand, or doing things in Japanese is like wearing a latex glove, where there's just like a little bit more in the way.
Yeah. For me, maybe it's more like a baseball glove.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends if it's a good day or not. But
yeah.
Another thing one of my friends said that I related to, sounds like you would relate to this as well, is like there's a little factory, and when you're speaking Japanese, you can like see there's like a conveyor belt that your brain is like has this Japanese sentence factory that it has to put everything together. Whereas in English, it seems like it just is done automatically. But
yeah. I agree with that.
I mean, I think you got to be careful saying this, because some people might hear that who haven't gotten this far at learning a language, and they think, oh, that sounds awful. But it doesn't mean that you don't get into a flow state at certain times, and you don't forget you're even speaking a foreign language. That happens, but even when that's happening, it's still different. It's still that thing's happening. It's just happening effortlessly.
Yeah.
But the other thing about how, when I talk to someone who I've never talked to before in Japanese for the first time, my priority is impressing them as much as possible and sounding as good as possible. And I will compromise saying what I really want to say in order to be correct. But when I start to know someone pretty well, then I don't care about impressing them. So I prioritize actually expressing what I want to express, even if I have to do it in a kind of unnatural way, or not be confident in the pitch accent or something like that. And so I definitely know what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. External factors affect my Japanese more than they affect my English.
Yeah, same. Like, I think I get more tired more quickly speaking Japanese. Like, after an hour, it gets way harder suddenly, but in English, that doesn't really happen.
Yeah.
So on this note, so we are also going to do a Patreon only video, and I asked my audience my patrons to send questions. One question that was really popular, but also fits in really nice right here is, basically along the same lines of what we've been talking about, but pitch accent in particular people are wondering, does pitch accent get to the point where it's completely automatic and natural and you don't have to think about it? It's like muscle memory, or is there still some part of the mind that is kind of consciously modulating the pitch and making sure that you're pronouncing it with the right pitch when you're speaking?
Right. Very interesting question. And I'm going to answer in kind of two different ways. One as someone who teaches pitch accent, and another answer is going to be from someone who studied pitch accent intensively and then stopped before starting to teach it. So initially, and we talked about this in our initial video, I guess, and maybe a little bit in this one as well, but I studied Japanese phonetics, pronunciation, and pitch accent fairly intensively at university. And I say intensively, but I don't mean that I studied the intermediate and advanced rules comprehensively. What I mean is that I became conscious of kind of the more basic rules, and I tried to nail those as best as I could. So like the classic example I always give is 4-syllable, 4-moral words that have 2 kanji or heibang. And as soon as you know that, your Japanese instantly improves. Like immediately you know the pitch accent for literally like probably thousands of words. I don't know if it's quite that much, at least hundreds of words. So there were like 4 or 5 rules like that I became aware of early on, that I just tried to drill those and listen for them in speech for several months. And then after that, because I'd spent so long on phonetics and speaking and surrounding myself with Japanese speakers, but not doing things like kanji and stuff like that, I noticed myself making diminishing returns in terms of phonetics. I was still improving, but the rate was much slower. I was like, okay, I'm going to stop this and I'm going to concentrate on kanji and advanced grammar and like reading in Japanese and stuff like that. And I feel like the best my spoken Japanese ever was, in terms of fluency, my ability to communicate ideas naturally and at a quick pace with not necessarily the absolute best pronunciation, but in a natural way, such that like a Japanese listener would not feel any like hikkakaru tokoro, like things to get caught on during the conversation. The best my Japanese ever was in that sense was immediately after I began making my transition from that phonetics intensive period to the grammar and everything else.
Okay.
Because all of those rules and everything that I had studied for so long, I had kind of made a decision to stop thinking about those so much. But as you mentioned, they had sort of become muscle memory or mind memory, perhaps. I had become conscious of them and unconscious of them during conversations. So there was that point in time. So what I always do, and I encourage people to do with my phonetic series, is I find that it's best to study pitch accent intensively and pronunciation as well for maybe half a year, and try and spend a lot of time on analyzing your own speech and really nailing the basic rules are, I think, probably the most important. Again, there's a diminishing returns, in terms of the pitch accent of numbers and stuff like that. There's a correct thing, but then there's many different acceptable pronunciations as well. So once I started teaching Japanese pitch accent on Patreon, I had to become more conscious of pitch accent in general, because I was now in a position where it was my responsibility to make sure that I was doing things in the correct way. And since centering myself in that location, in that position, that has slowed down that condition, that flow state that I talked about earlier. I certainly because I spend so much time each week writing these phonetic lessons on pitch accent and stuff like that, I tend to overthink pitch accent in conversation, specifically because I'm a pitch accent teacher. So again, I do think that in general, the normal learner, they will feel that their fluency takes a hit when they start studying phonetics. Their fluency will take a hit. Their pronunciation in general should improve dramatically if they've never studied pitch accent and pronunciation in detail or before. But then after that period, that's where the gains really start to show up.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, that's super interesting because I personally only started learning pitch accent after I had already been fluent in spoken Japanese for a while. I had a pretty interesting kind of different experience, I think, because I was already so used to speaking completely unconsciously, and then I suddenly brought all this kind of conscious stuff on board. But I think for me, there is a certain aspect where it becomes muscle memory, but there's kind of two versions of the muscle memory. The first kind of muscle memory that most people are thinking of is the way that your native language feels. I know lots of English grammar rules on an intuitive level, and I'm using them whenever I speak, but I couldn't articulate them to you. They're so unconscious, I literally have no idea how it's happening.
Right, yeah.
And so some pitch accent stuff happens like that.
Yes.
Maybe 1/3 of all the pitch. And then another third, it's happening consciously, but the act of doing it consciously itself becomes an unconscious habit.
Yeah, it's like you have an assistant in your mind preparing it for you. Like you said, like the factory.
Yeah. It's like there's some little guy's job in my brain who, when the word comes along, it's like he turns it this way, makes sure it comes out right. It comes out right. And I'm almost not aware of that happening because it's so automatic. But when if I paid attention, I can still tell oh yeah, this is something that doesn't happen in English. There's not a little guy when I speak English that's doing the stuff for me. And then there's another third of stuff where it's I need to actually, if I want to be as good as possible, I need to actually be thinking about it. And when I don't think about it, my accuracy drops, and I still miss stuff. But that's just where I'm at now after just a couple of years of less intense Japanese study, learning this afterwards. So I still am looking forward to seeing how my experience changes as I go on.
Yeah, absolutely. The main reason I try and encourage people whose goal is to sound as native as possible to study phonetics is because even if you don't actually get to that native level, you can get to a native level, and you can train that helper, that factory in your mind that's not there before.
Totally.
Through studying phonetics. So you can, even if you can't get to that 100%, you can. Most people can get significantly higher than where they are when they start, just by studying a very base level of phonetics and pitch accent information. So
yeah, it's like 80-20 rule. You can learning the 20% most of the simplest, most high yield stuff will have huge, positive effects on your Japanese later on down the line. So no matter who you are, I think you should at least learn the basics. It will definitely be worth the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Yeah.
Cool.
Although at the same time, I also always try and encourage people to study for their goals. So like there's a whole demographic of people who are like, who often like comment on my videos. They're like, but it doesn't matter if you have an accent. And my response to that is, well, it doesn't matter to you. There are some people who want to sound as native as possible. There are some people who don't care about what their pronunciation sounds like, as long as they're more or less they have a conversational ability in Japanese. So it's all about your goals. Like if you want to be a translator, like a translator for Japanese fiction, literature, something like that, pitch accent, you probably shouldn't put in too much study. You'd be better off just reading a lot of books in Japanese, taking a lot of notes, and trying to do a lot of translation by yourself. So it's best to study for the goals that you have, and that's the point that I try and make.
But I think at a certain point, like a 15-minute pitch accent lesson on the very basics, that alone could have a big impact down the line. So I think no matter who you are, you should at least like go take that 15-minute pitch accent lesson, like watch the first couple of videos in your phonetic series or something, because it's really hard to argue that you can't spare those 15 minutes and that it's not going to be worth the time.
I agree.
Even if that's
100%,
all you do.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff that I could ask you about, but we've been talking for a while, so I think we should probably
probably good to cut things here because we still got to do that Patreon exclusive video. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Hopefully, I was able to somewhat express myself in a way that didn't sound too. I don't like talking about my process because I always think that I end up sounding like I'm completely full of myself. So I'll leave it at that. Hopefully you guys were able to take something from this video.
Yeah. Well, I at least I had a great time and learned a lot. So
sweet.
Really awesome that we got to do this. And yeah, if you guys want to hear us talk more, then go check out the video that we're going to put up on Patreon. So yeah, we're
going to do a video for one video that's going to go on each of our Patreon pages where we answer everyone's specific questions. So if you want to see that, check out the links below. And thanks again to Matt for hosting me on this video.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. And of course, I'll put all of Dogen's links in the description as well. So definitely go and check those out.
Sweet.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.